I want to thank all of my colleagues, and I hope that we will be able to work together to move this nation forward for true energy independence. I want to thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Yeah, so we want to vote and skedaddle.
The senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to rescind the order of the quorum call,
Without objection.
and I ask that we move, ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The question is on the motion to proceed. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. How you doing? Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Harkin. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoeven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Burr, Cochran, Cornyn, Enzi, Hatch, Hutchison, Lugar, McConnell, Moran, Roberts, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Feinstein, Franken, Harkin, Inouye, Lieberman, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Rita Bird Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Paul. Yes. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dement, no. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Brown of Ohio, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, no. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to change their vote or to record their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 42, the nays are 57. Under a previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this motion, the motion is withdrawn.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 80, the nomination of Goodwin Liu of California to be United States Circuit Judge from the Ninth Circuit. Further, on Thursday, May 19th, following morning business, the Senate resumed consideration of the nomination, and the time until 2 p.m. be equally divided in the usual form prior to the cloture vote on the nominations, as under the previous order.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report.
Nomination: Goodwin Liu of California to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for 2 minutes.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today to call for the resignation of Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the head of the International Monetary Fund. The criminal allegations against Mr. Strauss-Kahn are alarming and undermine the confidence in the institution at a critical juncture of our economic history. Mr. Strauss-Kahn has forfeited our confidence and should resign or be fired from his position at the IMF. Over the last 2 years, the IMF presided over European debt crises, which included controversial bailouts of governments in Greece and Ireland and Portugal. I remain especially concerned about the U.S. taxpayer share of funding these European bailouts and the American taxpayers' exposure to new sovereign risks. While I have questions about the actions taken by the IMF to handle this debt crisis, the institution's role in the global financial system requires strong leadership. The IMF's Deputy Managing Director, John Lipsky, should assume full responsibility of the IMF, and process to determine a replacement should commence at once. I encourage the United States Executive Director to the IMF, Meg Lunziger, to strongly advocate for Mr. Strauss-Kahn's resignation or termination and aid in the search for a more worthy replacement. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that senior senator from Virginia who is about to speak, and I just will be brief. I wanted to applaud the President today on his comments, and in his administration's comments, especially Trade Ambassador Kirk and Gene Sperling, the President's top economic advisor. They have made it clear that they will not submit the 3 free trade agreements, one with Colombia, one with Panama, and one with South Korea, until legislation has come to their desk to take care of the issue of trade adjustment assistance. This Congress, because of some objections on the other side of the aisle, allowed the trade adjustment assistance language to expire in February. That simply means that many workers who lost their jobs because of free trade agreements, or lost their jobs because of trade, not necessarily with countries we had trade agreements, were going to get some assistance. They lost their jobs through no doing of their own. We're going to get some assistance so they could, in fact, get some assistance for retraining so they could go back to work. They didn't losing their jobs had everything to do with what happens in other ways, nothing to do with their job performance or even their company's job performance. So the President made the right decision by saying, we're not going to move forward on we're not going to move forward on these free trade agreements. I don't much like these agreements, but that's not the point. We're not going to move forward until we've done trade to help these workers that have lost jobs. Second, we need to make sure, as Senator Casey and I have said on the floor before, that the health coverage tax credit is also renewed. That matters to continue the health coverage of many workers. And third, that Senator Wyden's work and Senator Stabenow and Senator McCaskill will work on trade enforcement in making sure these trade rules and trade laws that are in effect will actually be enforced so that we can protect American jobs. We pass these trade agreements that always cost us jobs. It's about time we take care of workers in communities that suffer from it. I thank Senator Webb, and I yield back my time.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I would like to speak today on the pending nomination of Professor Goodwin Liu for a seat on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I would like to begin by saying, regretfully, I will be voting against this nomination for reasons that I will explain. But at the same time, I want to emphasize my profound respect for this institution and for my fellow senators from both parties, and I believe it would be wrong to vote against a cloture motion whose intent is to proceed forward with debate on the merits of someone who has been nominated to be a judge. I made this point loudly and clearly when the nomination of one of my Virginia constituents, Barbara Keenan, was filibustered, and with respect to philosophical consistency and my admiration for all the work that Chairman Leahy has been doing in order to fill the many vacancies on our federal court system, I am going to vote to proceed for the debate on Mr. Liu, but I do not, however, intend to vote in favor of his confirmation. I've met with Mr. Liu. I've read many of his writings and most of the testimony from his two confirmation hearings. He is clearly talented. Whatever he ends up doing, he is certain to have a long future in our country. He also has been blessed beyond words by the goodness of our society. Both his parents came to this country already as physicians. He attended our finest universities. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He is a Yale Law School graduate. And he has spent almost his entire career as a talented, if somewhat controversial, professor of law. When I met with Mr. Liu, I found him to be personable and clearly bright. But intellect, in and of itself, does not always give a person wisdom, nor does it guarantee good judgment. And the root word of judgment is, of course, judge. And this is our duty today, to decide whether Professor Liu's almost complete lack of practical legal experience, coupled with his history of intemperate, politically charged statements, allow us a measure of comfort and predictability as to whether he would be fair and balanced while sitting on one of the highest courts in the land. Mr. Liu's temperament and his frequently strident political views have been called into question by many well-intentioned observers, including my respected colleague, Senator Lindsey Graham, who, like myself, voted in favor of both Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. Senator Graham concluded that Professor Liu seems better fit for a life in politics rather than on the bench. My own concern is that we in the Senate have no real ability to know whether Mr. Liu could temporize these views or conduct himself in a different manner if he were to be given a seat in one of the highest judicial positions in our country. The list is long and time is short, Mr. President, but I would summarize my concerns through two observations. The first involves Professor Liu's public comments regarding Supreme Court Justice Alito, which I know will be repeated by others. Mr. Liu's view was that, quote, Judge Alito's record envisions an America where police may shoot and kill an unarmed boy to stop him from running away with a stolen purse, or a black man may be sentenced to death by an all-white jury for killing a white man. I humbly submit that this is not the America that we aspire to be, end quote. Obviously, I share the view of many others that whether one agrees or disagrees with Justice Alito's view of the Constitution, this is hardly a fair representation of his view of our society. The second observation is more telling, Mr. President, and it goes to the America that we all should aspire to be. An America where every person, regardless of race, creed, national origin, or personal circumstances, has the same opportunity to succeed to the full extent of their potential. Let me make a point that a lot of people seem uncomfortable with on speeches in this floor. That means white people, too. Economic disadvantage is not limited to one's race, ethnic background, or time of immigration to America. And when it comes to policies that are designed to provide diversity in our society, we do ourselves an enormous injustice by turning a blind eye to the wide variance among white cultures as we discuss greater representation from different minority groups. For all of his emphasis on diversity programs, I do not see anywhere that Mr. Liu understands this vital point. In fact, one tends to see the opposite. In 2004, Mr. Liu made a speech at an American Constitution Society conference. In this speech, he mentioned, quote, "The power of the courts to influence society, the power of legal principle to ratify inequality." He then went on to comment that, quote, "If we work hard, if we stick to our values, if we build a new moral consensus, then I think someday we will see Milliken, Rodriguez, Adarand be swept into the dustbin of history." So we know, first, that Mr. Liu wants to use the courts to influence society and to ratify his view of inequality. Okay? How does that fit into Adarand being swept into the dustbin of history? What was Adarand about? Well, Mr. President, it was about Randy Peck, one of 5 kids born to a welder and a mom whose family had lost their farm in Iowa during the Great Depression, who then worked as a sales clerk in a department store, neither of them ever going to college. Mr. Peck left college after 3 years and started a company that put up guardrails along highways. His startup was the money he would have used in his 4th year of college. And his loan was accomplished by using his parents' retirement pensions as collateral. He made a bid as a subcontractor on a highway construction project in Colorado that was by far the lowest bid. But he lost to a minority-owned company because our own government was paying bonuses to contractors who made subcontracts with so-called disadvantaged businesses. And Mr. Peck happened to be white. The Supreme Court decided that this was wrong and decided in Mr. Peck's favor, although the Civil Rights Commission pointed out 10 years later that the Supreme Court's decision was still not being complied with by federal agencies. Mr. Liu offered an explanation for his comments during his confirmation process, but taken in the context of his other remarks, I find that statement unconvincing. Mr. President, last July, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that while I continue to support the original goal of affirmative action, which was to assist African Americans who still suffer from the badges of discrimination and slavery, it's time for us to recognize that we harm ourselves anytime we cut away any person or group from the opportunity to reach their full potential in our wonderful and unique society. As you might imagine, I got a few questions from a few groups about this article. So let me answer those questions and sum up my concerns about Mr. Liu with an observation. The same day that my Wall Street Journal article ran, July 23rd, a remote area medical clinic was held in the open air of the Wise County Fairgrounds in the Appalachian Mountains of far southwest Virginia. These RAM clinics bring medical professionals into underserved areas where medical care is hard to find. They're not that different from what we used to do out in the impoverished villages of Vietnam when I was a Marine infantry officer many years ago. 12 of my staff members went down to Wise County to volunteer. Working in tents, mobile units, horse stalls, over these 3 days, the RAM clinic took care of 6,869 patient visits and pulled more than 4,000 teeth in the open air of the Wise County Fairgrounds. In this part of Virginia, nearly half the population lives below 200% of poverty. Almost a quarter of them have no insurance whatsoever. Age-adjusted mortality rates in some counties are as much as 70% higher than the rest of Virginia. in this Appalachian Mountain region is, of course, predominantly white. And let me emphasize, Mr. President, that these conditions proceed from cultural issues based on many generations of hardship and strife, and not simply individual choice. Mr. President, back there in those mountains, there is no doubt somebody who's thinking that if he could put together a little money and maybe get somebody to believe in him, maybe he could start up a construction company, just like Randy Peck did, and compete for government contracts on a completely fair playing field, which has always been the gift and the miracle of America. I want him to have that opportunity, just like I want every other American to have it. And I don't want a judge on a circuit court somewhere telling him that his own chance for a fair and prosperous future should be swept into the dustbin of history. I thank the chair and I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if a morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, over the past couple of days here on the Senate floor, we've had a lot of discussion of domestic energy production. And there have been a lot of good points made, but frankly, it was more of a political exercise than something that's really going to help the American people. If you're to listen to the debate, you might think there's no consensus and really no way forward. I disagree with that. I think given our energy challenges, including $4 gasoline, we need a better energy policy that encourages more affordable energy, more reliable energy, and cleaner energy. And I think we can reach a consensus on a few of those areas and do it now. Let me raise a couple of them today. First is natural gas exploration and development. In my own state of Ohio, we've had exciting new developments over the past several years. Geologists have known that we have big shale formations in the eastern part of the United States for years, but until recently we haven't had the drilling technologies that have allowed us to tap these huge reserves. We now have that. In Ohio, we have both the Marcellus and the Utica shale finds that unfortunately have not been tapped yet but have tremendous potential. Some of the oil and gas reserve estimates associated with these finds are truly amazing. For the state of Ohio alone, in one of those formations, Utica, I am told that we could yield over 15 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So this is a great opportunity, both to be sure that we have the energy we need to power our economy, but also to create jobs that goes into energy production. And by the way, other states around us, including Pennsylvania, West Virginia, upstate New York, as example, have even more production potential than Ohio. Already there's some Ohio counties like Belmont County, Jefferson County, and Columbiana County that are beginning to explore some of these finds, and we're very hopeful that in some of these counties, where there's incredibly high unemployment, that we'll be able to begin production soon. These counties have been hard hit by the downturn in the economy, and they can really use the economic activity and the jobs that will be created by this production. Earlier this year, I visited an Ohio company that's an example of one of the industries that's going to really benefit from this natural gas production. It's V&M Star. It's a company that makes piping. It's near Youngstown, Ohio, and they've just decided to expand their manufacturing capability. Why? Because they're looking at the Marcellus and the Utica, understanding this is going to create great opportunities for them. They're investing in our state, they're investing in jobs, and they're doing it because of these finds. We've got to be sure that we put out the federal policies to promote and encourage the development of these resources. In addition to using natural gas for electricity generation and as a feedstock for a lot of industries, including the chemical industry, natural gas holds incredible potential as an alternative for gas. So today we're talking about the need to be less dependent on foreign oil, which happens to be one of the top issues on both sides of the aisle here. Well, natural gas is the way we can do that very directly because it can be used particularly in fleets. Today, the equivalent price for a gallon of natural gas is $1.60 a gallon. Think about that, as compared to $4 gasoline, $1.60 for natural gas. The infrastructure costs create some challenges, but again, for fleets where there is central refueling, it makes all the sense in the world. And widespread conversion of our fleets, including our nation's buses, garbage trucks, utility vehicles, would help reduce the demand for gasoline. America arguably has the greatest energy reserves in the world, depending on which estimate you look at. We've got to find a way to responsibly tap these reserves in a way that we can become less dependent on foreign nations for our energy needs, in a way that we will stop sending so much of our wealth overseas to pay for foreign imports, particularly of crude oil. Ohio is still in the throes of an economic downturn. Today we're at 9% unemployment in Ohio. Underemployment makes Ohio's situation even worse. And one way to create jobs and to get Ohio back on track is by expanding, again, the use of our own resources, including natural gas. There should be a consensus on this. We should be promoting federal policies to encourage the exploration and the development of these resources, and we should do it now. Another area where I think you could see some consensus on energy policy in the short term here in the United States Senate is in the area of energy conservation and efficiency. We should both find more and use less. And it's that commitment to use less that led me last week to introduce legislation with Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire called the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act. It's S-1000 for those who'd like to check it out. It's a bipartisan bill, targeted and achievable piece of legislation that would leverage energy efficiency investments in a number of areas, including the building and industrial sectors, but also with the federal government. It will help consumers, help the federal government save money on energy bills, and it will help industry improve the efficiency of their production processes. Again, this is an example where we should be able to come together as Republicans and Democrats and get something done. There's widespread consensus that energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, a way to reduce our energy use and, again, to make America's economy more competitive. As with anything, the devil's in the details. There'll be some senators who may disagree with some of the specifics in this legislation, but again, it's the type of bill we should be debating on the floor of this Senate, and with little hard work, I believe it's one that we can ultimately get enacted into law. Instead, again, we spent the better part of this week debating two bills. One that, in my view, would have done more harm than good by raising taxes on certain businesses while doing nothing to increase energy production or lower gas prices. And another, one that I supported and I think would do a lot of good, but we knew did not have the necessary 60 votes to move forward, and therefore we were not able to make progress this week for the American people. Mr. President, we have all the ingenuity, the know-how, and the resources within our own borders to be able to have the energy we need to run our economy and to improve our economy and create jobs. I would hope that moving forward we can find agreement on these issues and begin to tap this great American potential. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and no...
Mr. President.
Will the senator withhold his quorum call?
I will.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in strong support of the nomination of Goodwin Liu to be a U.S. Circuit Judge for the U.S. Circuit Appeals, Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And I urge my colleagues to invoke cloture on this nomination. I am disappointed that we had to file a cloture petition. I would hope that my colleagues would want to vote up or down on this nomination, and I hope that they would vote for his confirmation. As we begin the debate on the nomination of Mr. Liu, let me start by telling my colleagues how thoroughly his nomination has been vetted by the Judiciary Committee under the leadership of Chairman Leahy. President Obama first nominated Goodwin Liu for this position in February of last year. That's over 1 year ago. The Judiciary Committee has held 2 separate hearings on this nomination. Mr. Liu's latest set of questions and answers for the record spanned over 130 pages. The Judiciary Committee has favorably reported his nomination on 3 separate occasions, in May of 2010, September of 2010, and April of 2011. So I'm disappointed that my Republican colleagues have refused to allow this nomination to come to a vote without the necessity of filing a cloture petition. And as you know, the Majority Leader has filed cloture on this nomination. Senators have had ample information on the background, experience, and qualifications of this nominee, and it's time for the senators to perform their constitutional duty to debate the nomination and to vote up or down on this nominee. Mr. President, I was privileged to serve on the Judiciary Committee in the 111th Congress and participated in a debate of Goodwin Liu on several occasions. I was pleased to cast my vote in favor of Mr. Liu's nomination, and I look forward to supporting his nomination on the floor. When I examine judicial nominations that are submitted by the President, I use several criteria. First, I believe judicial nominees must have an appreciation for the Constitution and the protections it provides to each and every American. Second, a nominee must embrace a judicial philosophy that reflects mainstream American values, not narrow ideological interests. Third, a judicial nominee must respect the role and responsibilities of each branch of government, including a healthy respect for the precedents of the court. Fourth, I look for nominees with a strong commitment and passion for the continued forward progress of civil rights protection. And finally, I want a judge who has the necessary experience, temperament, and commitment to public service. I want to share with my colleagues a little of the background on Mr. Liu, his qualifications, and why I intend to support his nomination. Goodwin Liu in many ways embodies the American dream. He's the son of immigrants in this country. His parents were doctors who came to the United States from Taiwan in the late 1960s, when foreign doctors were being recruited to work in underserved areas. Goodwin Liu did not speak English until kindergarten. During high school, Professor Liu had the opportunity to serve as a page in the United States House of Representatives after being sponsored by the late Congressman Bob Matsui of California, who I had the privilege of serving with in the House of Representatives. Professor Liu has a sterling academic record. He earned his B.A. Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford University, where he was elected co-president of the student body. A Rhodes Scholar, he earned his M.A. from Oxford University. He received his J.D. from Yale Law School, where he was editor of the Yale Law Journal. He then went on to clerk for D.C. Circuit Judge David Tatel and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Professor Liu has a track record of working on public policy issues in public service. He worked for 2 years at the Corporation for National Service. He served as Special Assistant to Deputy Secretary of Education, where he worked on numerous legal and policy issues. Professor Liu has worked in private practice. After his clerkships, he served as an associate in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Mavalny and Myers, working on a wide range of business matters. About half of his practice consisted of appellate litigation, preparing him well to serve on the Court of Appeals. He's also maintained an active pro bono practice at that firm, which also tells me his commitment to equal justice under the law. Professor Liu then went on to his current occupation, joining the faculty of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and helping to teach our next generation of lawyers. He serves as a professor at the law school, was promoted to an associate dean of the law school, and was elected to the American Law Institute. Professor Liu has received the Law School Distinguished Teaching Award. Professor Liu is considered an expert on constitutional law and education, law and policy, with a particular focus on the needs of America's most disadvantaged students. He's the author of numerous law review articles and co-author of an influential book on constitutional interpretation entitled Keeping Faith with the Constitution. Mr. President, I heard my colleague talk about Goodwin Liu, but I would just urge my colleagues not to penalize an individual because he's active or expresses his own opinions. We should judge the nominees based upon their qualifications and their commitments to interpret the law as required on the court. Professor Liu answered numerous questions about his approach to constitutional interpretation during his 2 confirmation hearings. He testified that, and I quote, "The role of a judge is to be an impartial, objective, and neutral arbiter of specific cases and controversies that come before him or her. And the way that process works is through absolute fidelity to applicable precedents and the language of the laws, statutes, and regulations that are issued in the case," end quote. I don't know of who would disagree with that. That's what many of us have been calling for on both sides of the aisle. He's also answered questions about his ideology as a judge. He testified that, and I quote, "It would not be my role to bring any particular theory of constitutional interpretation to the job of an intermediate appellate judge. The duty of a circuit judge is to faithfully follow the Supreme Court instructions on matters of constitutional interpretation, not any particular theory. And so that is exactly what I would do. I would apply the applicable precedents to the facts of each case, end quote. Once again, Mr. President, I couldn't agree with that statement more. In written responses to Senators' questions, he also stated that, and I quote, "I do not believe it's ever appropriate for judges to indulge their own values or policy preferences in determining what the Constitution and laws mean," end quote. Professor Liu certainly has written a number of thought-provoking articles on controversial public policy issues of the day, but this should not disqualify him from being a judge. I am confident that Professor Liu understands the difference between being an advocate and being a judge, and I hope we can draw that distinction. And will respect the differences if he is confirmed and puts on the judicial robe. Mr. President, the specific question concerning affirmative action were asked during his confirmation hearings. So let me quote from Professor Liu's testimony to the Judiciary Committee, and I quote, "I absolutely do not support racial quotas in my writings, and I think I have made that very clear, that I believe they are unconstitutional," end quote. He then said, I quote, "I think affirmative action as it was originally conceived was a time-limited remedy for past wrongs, and I think it is an appropriate way to understand what affirmative action is," end quote. So I think we should take a look at his record on this. And I think that it's unfair to judge him based upon certain innuendos. Professor Liu also has broad support from distinguished legal scholars from both parties. Former Solicitor General and White House prosecutor Ken Starr praised Professor Liu, and I'm going to quote, "His strong intellect, demonstrated independence, and outstanding character," end quote. The qualifications that we all want to see on the court. We want to see intellect, we want to see independence, and we want to see character. Ken Starr, I think, summed that up fairly well. In a March 19, 2010 letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee, Mr. Starr joined with another professor stating, and I'm going to quote again, "Goodwin is a person of great intellect, accomplishment, and integrity, and he is exceptionally well qualified to serve on the Court of Appeals. What we wish to highlight beyond his obvious intellect and legal talents is his independence and openness to diverse viewpoints, as well as his ability to follow the facts and the law to their logical conclusion. These are qualities we expect in a judge, and Goodwin clearly possesses them. A judge takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, and in the case of a circuit judge, fidelity to the law entails adherence to Supreme Court precedent and adherence to circuit precedent as well. Goodwin knows the difference between what the law is and what he might wish it to be, and he is fully capable and unafraid of discharging the duty to say what the law is," end quote. Mr. President, that is what Ken Starr said about a person he knows very well, Goodwin Liu, and strongly recommends his confirmation to our colleagues. I also want to discuss the importance of improving diversity on our courts. If confirmed, Professor Liu would be only the second Asian American currently serving on a federal appeals court and the only Asian American in active service in the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit is home to over 40% of Asian American population in the United States. Finally, Mr. President, Professor Liu has received the highest possible judicial rating, unanimously well qualified from the American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary. Mr. President, with this distinguished record and recommendations that we have received, we have an excellent nominee to serve on the Court of Appeals. I urge my colleagues to vote for his confirmation. And with that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.